The Chinese Communist Party just had its 100th birthday. And quite frankly, it was really disgusting to see all the American corporations that congratulated the Communist Party on its happy birthday CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Now, for almost 30 years, we've been hearing from, not just from the left, even from some of the so-called neoconservatives, this notion that China is liberalizing. And as the doctrine goes, China must liberalize because that is the inevitable effect of market capitalism. Capitalism, in other words, causes people to enjoy economic prosperity. As they enjoy more economic prosperity, they demand to get more rights. I want the right to speak. I want the right to speak my conscience. And so this puts pressure on the government to give you not merely economic rights and liberties, but also civil liberties. Now, it's very instructive against this sort of mythology, I would call it, about China, to see how the Chinese themselves see it. And amidst all the deafening and massive celebrations in China, beautifully organized, I have to say, with grudging respect, I've got a transcript of Xi Jinping's speech to the Chinese. Now, what's good about the speech is this is not a speech tailored for the Western audience. It is aimed at the Chinese. He's talking to his fellow Chinese, and therefore he is giving his view, the Communist Party view, of China itself. And we think of China, we often hear in this country in articles in places like Foreign Affairs about how China broke with its kind of long-standing Marxist tradition that beginning with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s and continuing with Hua, and then now with Xi, the Chinese have moved into kind of a new direction, a direction that's more kind of harmonious with the West. The Chinese have moved away from insularity toward a kind of global involvement, and all of this is seen as to the good. But this is sort of not the Chinese view at all. In fact, Xi begins by talking about, quote, the glorious journey the party, and he means not China, he means the Communist Party has traveled over 100 years of struggle. And he talks about how the party is the leader of, quote, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. What he means by rejuvenation is China having been a third-rate country, a backward power, humiliated time and time again, going back to the Opium War of 1840, that China is now becoming a superpower. And I think their goal is, he doesn't say this explicitly, to become the sole superpower. So not to share superpower status, not to have a bipolar world in which the US-Soviet rivalry is replaced by the US-Chinese, but rather to have a unipolar world in which China is sitting at the top and everybody else sits kind of around it in tribute. He talks about the fact that the Communist Party is explicitly Marxist. He goes, in 1917, Marxism-Leninism was brought to China. And he talks about the fact that the Chinese have Marxism, quote, with Chinese characteristics. So in other words, kind of a distinctive form of Marxism. But there is no sense, as you read this, that the Chinese have repudiated either Marxism or socialism. In fact, he says, by carrying out socialist revolution, we eliminated the exploitive and repressive feudal system that had persisted in China for thousands of years. So he credits the socialist era, the era of Mao, for example, for having wiped out the kind of ancient tradition that went all the way back to Confucius. And then he goes on to say that, yeah, we now have a market economy, but he says nevertheless that it is, quote, a highly centralized planned economy, which is to say that this is you may say, a state-run capitalism, almost a kind of new notion. It is capitalism in that you have industry, you have trade, but it is trade that is being orchestrated and directed from the center, and is directed by people who do not consider themselves to be capitalists, but rather communists. He takes a lot of credit, and some of it deserved, for raising the standard of living of the Chinese. But this, he says very clearly, involves no expansion of civil liberties and no relinquishing of power by the Central Communist Party Committee. In fact, he goes, we must uphold the firm leadership of the party. Quote, without the Communist Party of China, there would be no new China and no national rejuvenation. The leadership of the party constitutes the greatest strength of the system. And then he says a little bit later, Marxism is the fundamental guiding ideology upon which our party and country are founded. It is the very soul of our party. We will use Marxism to observe, understand, and steer the trends of our times. And then he ends with something very interesting. He says, we will not accept sanctimonious preaching from those who feel they have the right to lecture us. Here he's talking to the Biden administration. Basically what he's saying is what the Chinese diplomats told the Biden diplomats a few months ago, back off. You're no one to lecture us about human rights. You yourself confess that you're violating human rights in your own country. He goes on to say, Xi does, we will never allow any foreign bully to oppress or subjugate us. Anyone who attempts to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. So this is tough talk coming from China. And it suggests to me a confident tone. The Chinese are no longer kind of, you may say, keeping this sort of slinking, silent, let's bide our time approach. Rather, they feel sort of peacock style, ready to strut upon the world stage. And finally, he says, Xi does, we have pioneered a new and unique Chinese path to modernization and created a new model for human advancement. Now, I think what the Chinese here are saying is this. There are really two viable systems of organizing a society left in the world. There is the kind of the freedom approach, the Western approach, which tries to combine economic freedom with civic liberty, civil liberty, and the kind of open society. And he goes, look what the result is. America is a kind of a mess. And Europe is a kind of a mess. And so we in China have a better model, which combines tyranny in the political sense with economic or market freedom. And so we're able to raise the living standards of people. And he implies that's all the Chinese people want. They're happy to have their standards of living improved. They don't care about any of the other freedoms. These are all false freedoms, so to speak, that are being offered in the West. I think what we're seeing here is that China is now taking the place of Russia. And in some ways, it is an even more dangerous opponent than the old Soviet Union. It's certainly wealthier. It has much better technology. And quite frankly, it has more people, which is to say that while the Russians could have put 20, 30 million people on a battlefield, the Chinese can put 100 million people on a battlefield. And that is a frightening thought to contemplate. So as I look not just at the months and years ahead, but over, let's say, the next couple of decades, I think that the United States is going to have its hands full with a very dangerous and formidable adversary, and all of this at a time when America itself is, if not in decline, in a very serious way, divided and fractured, a society, in my view, ill-equipped for this kind of challenge.